is Solidarity won every single seat for which it could compete but won. And then only 3 people in the communist designated seats actually won. So who won all the rest of them? The box on the ballot called none of the above. Yes, the Roman Catholic Church had...
What if I told you that the terrifying might of the Soviet Empire, a superpower with thousands of nuclear warheads and millions of soldiers, wasn't defeated on the battlefield? It wasn't destroyed by NATO tanks, and it wasn't dismantled by American diplomacy. The weapon that actually killed the legitimacy of communism in Eastern Europe was a checkbox. Specifically, a box on a ballot called none of the above. You might think the fall of the Iron Curtain began in Berlin with sledgehammers. But you'd be looking at the wrong country, and the wrong month. The real domino fell first in Poland, in June 1989. And it happened because of a single, catastrophic miscalculation by the communist regime, a mistake that revealed a truth so shocking, it made the entire system evaporate overnight. In this series, we are going to dissect exactly why Poland fell first, and how that single event created a contagion that no wall could stop. To understand why this specific election was the patient zero of the Soviet collapse, we have to look at the state of Poland in early 1989. The country was in economic ruin. Hyperinflation was looming, shelves were empty, and the Communist Party, led by General Jaruzelski, was desperate. They weren't looking to give up power, they were looking to share the blame for the economic austerity measures they needed to impose. This is a critical distinction in geopolitical analysis. The regime didn't want democracy, they wanted legitimacy. They invited the opposition movement, Solidarity, to the round table talks not out of kindness, but out of necessity. The deal was supposed to be rigged. The communists guaranteed themselves a majority in the lower house, leaving only 35% of seats open for free election. They thought this controlled democracy would co-opt the opposition without threatening their grip on power. They were wrong. They fundamentally misunderstood the psychology of their own citizens. Here is the tactical detail that changed history, the butterfly effect in action. The election rules were complicated, but the Roman Catholic Church, a massive force of influence in Poland, simplified it for the voters. They provided a quiet, devastating instruction: cross them all out. On the ballot, there was a national list of 35 prominent communist leaders running unopposed. To win, they needed 50% of the valid votes. The regime assumed people would just drop the paper in the box. But the people didn't. They actively crossed out the names of the communist leaders. The result on June 4, 1989, was not just a loss, it was a humiliation. Solidarity won 99 out of 100 seats in the newly created Senate. They won every single seat in the Sejm they were allowed to contest. But the real shocker? On that national list of top communists running unopposed, 33 out of 35 failed to get 50% of the vote. They were defeated by the empty space on the ballot. This wasn't just a political defeat, it was a total collapse of legitimacy. In political science, a regime can rule by force or by legitimacy. Force is expensive and brittle. Legitimacy is cheap and resilient. When the Polish people used that checkbox to say no, they stripped the emperor of his clothes. The Communist Party didn't just lose an election, they lost the pretense that they represented the working class. And once that pretense is gone, as we will see, there is no going back. In geopolitics, ideas are more dangerous than armies because ideas recognize no borders. Once the Polish people proved that the Communist Party could be defeated, not by force, but by simply refusing to grant it legitimacy, that realization didn't stay in Warsaw. It traveled west, straight into the heart of the Soviet Union's most critical satellite, East Germany. We call this democratic contagion. And just 4 months after the Polish elections, that contagion hit Berlin. To understand the irony of this moment, you have to look at the calendar. It was October 1989. The German Democratic Republic was celebrating its 40th anniversary. It was supposed to be a massive display of power, stability, and socialist achievement. But while the parades were marching in Berlin, the real story was happening in the city of Leipzig. This is where the second domino began to wobble. It started with a small group. But on October 9th, 70,000 people took to the streets of Leipzig. This was unprecedented in a police state known for the Stasi, one of the most pervasive surveillance agencies in human history. Now, historically, we know how communist regimes dealt with this kind of insubordination. The standard operating procedure was the Chinese solution: send in the tanks, clear the streets, and restore order through fear. The East German government had the means to do this. They had the army, they had the police. Everyone expected violence. The hospitals in Leipzig had even been cleared in preparation for mass casualties. But then, something extraordinary happened. Or rather, something extraordinary failed to happen. The tanks didn't roll. The order to shoot never came. Why? The transcript of history tells us that the leadership was paralyzed. Erich Honecker, the hardline leader who had ruled East Germany since 1971, was politically dead walking. His ruinous economic policies had been living off Western debt for decades, and the country was effectively bankrupt. He had lost the support of his own party, and perhaps more importantly, he had lost the backing of Moscow. Without the guarantee of Soviet tanks to back them up, the East German leadership blinked. That moment of hesitation was fatal for the regime. When the people realized the government wouldn't shoot, the barrier of fear evaporated. The protests exploded. Within a single week, that crowd of 70,000 in Leipzig grew into a nationwide movement. We saw 1.4 million East Germans demonstrating across the country. This wasn't just a protest anymore, it was a revolution. And unlike previous uprisings in 1953 or 1968, this one was unstoppable because the regime had lost its two pillars of power: economic solvency and the threat of violence. Honecker was forced out. But removing one man couldn't stop the avalanche. The entire Council of Ministers resigned. The Politburo resigned. The structure of the state was melting away in real time. By early November, the government was in chaos, frantically trying to draft new regulations to appease a population that was no longer asking for reform, they were demanding freedom. And amidst this chaos, a minor bureaucrat was handed a piece of paper that would change the world map forever. History often turns not on grand speeches or military strategies, but on administrative errors. We tend to look for deep, structural causes for the fall of empires, and while those certainly exist, sometimes the final blow is delivered by something incredibly banal. In the case of the Berlin Wall, it didn't fall because of a treaty, it fell because a tired man misread a memo. This is the story of the most consequential press conference of the 20th century. It is November 9, 1989. The East German government is in a state of panic. Following the resignation of the old guard, the new leadership is desperately trying to save the regime. Their strategy is to offer a concession, a new travel law. The plan was not to tear down the wall. The plan was to allow East Germans to travel abroad with permission, provided they applied for a visa. It was meant to be a safety valve to release the pressure of the protests, a way to buy time and restore a semblance of order. Enter Gunter Schabowski, the party's spokesman. Schabowski had not been present at the crucial meeting where these complex new regulations were drafted. Just before he walked out to face the international press, he was handed a piece of paper containing the new rules. He hadn't read them. He didn't know the nuances. Crucially, he didn't know that there was supposed to be an embargo on the announcement until the next morning, to give the border guards time to prepare. For an hour, the press conference was incredibly dull. It was standard communist bureaucracy, dry, repetitive, and uninspiring. But then, almost as an afterthought, Schabowski mentioned the travel changes. A journalist raised his hand and asked the single most important question of the Cold War: when does this come into effect? Schabowski looked down at his papers. He shuffled them nervously. He adjusted his glasses. He clearly didn't know the answer. So, he improvised. He looked at the text, saw no date, and delivered the line that killed the Iron Curtain. As far as I know. Immediately, without delay. Those words were broadcast live on East German television. The intent of the party was a slow, controlled process of visa applications. The outcome of Schabowski's improvisation was an announcement of total, immediate freedom. This moment highlights a critical weakness in authoritarian regimes, the breakdown of information. In a system built on rigid hierarchy and secrecy, when the chain of command snaps, the entire structure collapses. Schabowski didn't mean to open the wall. He meant to read a press release. But in the volatile atmosphere of 1989, intent no longer mattered. Only the signal mattered. And the signal had just been sent to millions of people sitting in their living rooms: the cage is open. The words immediately, without delay, traveled faster than any missile the Soviets had ever built. Within minutes of Schabowski's press conference, the streets of East Berlin began to fill. It wasn't a coordinated march, it was a spontaneous wave of humanity driven by a mixture of disbelief and hope. People left their dinners on the table. They put on their coats. They walked to the checkpoints, not necessarily to cross, but to see if it was true. They wanted to test the reality of what they had just heard on television. This brings us to the most tense standoff of the night. Imagine the situation from the perspective of the border guards. For decades, their standing order was simple and brutal: Schießbefehl, the order to shoot. Their job was to prevent escape at any cost. They had spent their entire careers guarding the anti-fascist protection rampart. Now, thousands of their own citizens were pressing against the gates, demanding to pass, citing the party spokesman they saw on the news. But the guards had no orders. The phone lines to their superiors were jammed or ringing unanswered. The chain of command, paralyzed by the speed of events, had gone silent. At the Bornholmer Strasse checkpoint, the pressure was critical. The commander in charge faced an impossible choice. He could follow his old training and open fire, creating a massacre that would stain history and likely start a civil war. Or, he could do the unthinkable: open the barrier without authorization. In the source material, this moment is described with a phrase that perfectly captures the collapse of authority: the guards decided that discretion was the better part of valor. At 11:30 p.m., the order was given. The barrier lifted. What followed was not just a migration, it was a dam breaking. East Germans poured into West Berlin. There were no visa checks, no stamps, no questions. The bureaucracy simply dissolved under the weight of the people. Strangers hugged in the streets. West Berliners climbed onto the wall to pull their Eastern counterparts up. The symbol of division became a dance floor. The scale of this event is hard to comprehend without the data. We aren't talking about a few thousand defectors. Within the first week alone, over half of East Germany's entire population, millions of people, visited the West. They went to see the forbidden world, to visit family, or simply to breathe air that felt different. And while most returned home that night, the psychological border was gone forever. Within a month, 1% of the population permanently immigrated to the West. This wasn't just a party, it was a demographic hemorrhage. Just like the Polish elections, the opening of that gate was a pivotal decision. In game theory, we call this a point of no return. Once the gate is open, you cannot close it again without using force on a scale that was no longer politically possible. The wall stood for 28 years as a monument to state control. It took less than 6 hours for it to become a souvenir. While Berlin was partying, Moscow was watching in stunned silence. To understand the collapse of the Soviet Union, we must look at the immense gap between what the Kremlin thought would happen and what actually occurred. Mikhail Gorbachev and the Soviet leadership suffered from a fatal delusion. They believed that by loosening their grip and allowing liberalization, they would be celebrated. They imagined a reformed, socialist community of nations where the Soviet Union would be thanked for East Europe's liberation. They expected gratitude. Instead, they got a divorce. And it wasn't amicable, it was a race for the door. The Soviets had fundamentally underestimated the deep-seated resentment within their satellite states. For decades, these nations had not viewed the Soviets as protectors, but as occupiers. As soon as the threat of tanks was removed, the entire Warsaw Pact didn't just drift away, it sprinted. Yuri Rizhov, a prominent Soviet scientist and parliamentarian, captured this realization with a brutal assessment. He noted that all of their former satellites, bound to them by compulsion, were now casting off from Moscow as fast and as far as possible. The ideology of socialist brotherhood, which had been the propaganda glue of the Eastern Bloc for 40 years, dissolved instantly upon contact with reality. But the political humiliation was secondary to the military catastrophe. The Soviet superpower relied on the Warsaw Pact as a buffer zone against the West. Suddenly, the Kremlin had to ask a terrifying strategic question: if a war starts, whose side are these armies on? Anatoly Kovalev, a Soviet deputy foreign minister at the time, was remarkably candid about this security nightmare. He admitted that Moscow had no confidence whatsoever regarding whom the East German, Polish, or Hungarian armies would shoot. Would they fire on NATO? Or would they turn their guns on the Soviets? In a moment of dark humor that defined the era, Kovalev summed up the strategic collapse of the Soviet outer empire with a single rhetorical question: with allies like this, who needs enemies? This realization marked the end of the Cold War, not with a treaty, but with a forfeit. The Soviet Union didn't lose on the battlefield, it simply realized that its assets were actually liabilities. The empire had become a trap. The allies were unreliable, the populations were hostile, and the cost of maintaining control was bankrupting the center. Some historians argue that unrest in the empire forced the Soviet Union to give up. But as we will explore next, there is a counter-argument. Perhaps the Soviet Union didn't fall just because the satellites broke free, but because the satellites themselves were terminally unhealthy, a sickness that infected the host. There is a prevailing narrative that people in the streets simply overwhelmed the Soviet tanks. That the sheer force of the human spirit defeated the machine. While that is inspiring, there is a colder, harder truth that we must examine, a counter-argument that challenges the romantic version of history. Some geopolitical analysts look at the theory that unrest forced the Soviet forfeit and reject it. They argue that the unrest was merely a symptom, not the root cause. The real reason the Soviet Union let Eastern Europe go without a fight wasn't just because they were afraid of the people. It was because the satellites were undeniably unhealthy. By 1989, the Eastern Bloc was no longer a trophy for Moscow, it was a massive, bleeding liability. To understand this, we have to look at the balance sheet of the Cold War. In the early days, the Soviet Union extracted wealth from its satellites to rebuild its own devastated economy. But by the 1970s and 80s, the flow of value had reversed. The Soviet economy, reliant on oil exports, was effectively subsidizing the energy consumption of East Germany, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, selling them oil and gas at prices far below the global market rate. Moscow was paying billions of dollars a year to maintain an empire that offered them nothing in return but resentment. The unhealthy diagnosis goes deeper than just subsidies. The entire economic model of the Eastern Bloc had rotted from the inside. Leaders like Erich Honecker in East Germany had refused to reform. Instead, they maintained a facade of prosperity by living off Western loans. They built a welfare state on a foundation of debt, importing technology and consumer goods they couldn't afford to produce themselves. When the credit lines dried up, the illusion collapsed. Poland was facing hyperinflation. East Germany was technically bankrupt. Romania was starving its people to pay off foreign debt. From the Kremlin's perspective, these allies were not strong partners who could help defend the Soviet borders. They were terminally ill patients requiring constant, expensive life support. And the Soviet Union, struggling with its own economic crisis under Gorbachev, simply could not afford the hospital bill anymore. This changes how we view the domino effect. It wasn't just that one democracy movement triggered another. It was that the central power, the Soviet Union, made a calculated decision to cut the rope. They realized that if they held onto these sinking economies, they would be dragged down with them. So, when the Polish elections happened, and when the Berlin Wall cracked, Moscow didn't send tanks because, in a brutal strategic sense, they were relieved to see these burdens go. They hoped that by shedding the unhealthy satellites, they might save the Soviet core. But as we will see in the final chapters of this story, you cannot amputate a limb to save a body that is already dying from the same disease. The contagion of freedom, and the reality of economic failure, was already inside the Kremlin walls. When a totalitarian regime dies, it rarely happens with a whisper. Usually, it ends in a violent struggle. But in East Germany in the autumn of 1989, we witnessed a different phenomenon, a structural implosion. Once it became clear that the Soviet Union would not intervene, and that the Chinese solution of violent suppression was off the table, the East German government entered a state of terminal panic. We have to appreciate the speed of this collapse. For 40 years, the Socialist Unity Party, SED, had maintained absolute control over every aspect of life, from the schools to the factories, from the media to the secret police. It was a monolith. Yet, it took less than 30 days for this monolith to disintegrate into dust. The first domino to fall inside the palace was Erich Honecker himself. On October 18th, just days after the mass protests in Leipzig, the party forced him to resign. This was a classic move in authoritarian survival manuals: sacrifice the leader to save the system. The party hoped that by removing the face of the dictatorship, they could appease the anger in the streets. But they had fundamentally misread the situation. The protesters weren't just angry at Honecker, they were done with the entire system. The domino effect then moved from the individual to the institution. On November 7th, the entire Council of Ministers, the government body responsible for the daily administration of the state, resigned en masse. The very next day, November 8th, the Politburo resigned. Let's pause to analyze what this means. The Politburo was the real center of power. These were the men who made the decisions, the inner circle of the dictatorship. In a matter of 48 hours, the entire executive and legislative brain of East Germany effectively quit. Why did they fold so quickly? Because they were facing a political vacuum. Without the backing of Soviet tanks, and with their own economy in ruins, they had no leverage left. They tried to replace the hardliners with reformers, but the population was moving faster than the party meetings could keep up. Every concession the government made, promising free elections, promising media freedom, was met with demands for more. The party was trying to patch a dam that had already burst. This creates the specific chaotic environment that led to the final mistake. By November 9th, the government was functioning on autopilot. There was no clear chain of command. Exhausted officials were drafting new regulations on the fly, trying to create a pressure valve to stop the mass exodus of citizens escaping through Czechoslovakia and Hungary. They thought that if they offered a legal way to travel, people would stay. It was a desperate gamble: give the people a little bit of freedom so they don't take it all. But as we know, in an environment of total institutional collapse, even a small administrative error can become a world-changing event. The stage was now set for the final act, where a confused government, trying to save itself, accidentally signed its own death warrant. When we look back at the events of 1989, it is easy to get lost in the sheer scale of the history. We see millions of people in the streets. We see the Berlin Wall, a structure of concrete and rebar weighing hundreds of tons, being dismantled by hand. We see the map of Europe being redrawn. But if we strip away the noise and the crowds, we are left with a single, undeniable truth about power. The Soviet Union and its satellite states spent decades building the ultimate machinery of control. They had the Stasi to watch you. They had the army to shoot you. They had the party to indoctrinate you. They built a system that was designed to be invincible against external attack and internal dissent. And yet, it all came crashing down because of a piece of paper. This brings us back to where we started, the Polish election of June 1989. That humble ballot paper with the none of the above option was not just a voting mechanism. It was a litmus test for reality. For 40 years, the communist regimes had survived on a lie, the lie that they ruled with the consent of the people. As long as that lie was unchallenged, the system held together. But the moment the Polish people used that checkbox to say no, calmly, legally, and overwhelmingly, the lie evaporated. They proved that the emperor had no clothes. This is the true mechanics of the domino effect. It wasn't just that protests spread from Warsaw to Leipzig to Berlin. It was that the knowledge of the regime's weakness spread. When the Polish voters rejected the party, they taught the East Germans that the government could be beaten. When the East Germans realized the Soviets wouldn't shoot, they taught the world that the tanks were powerless. And when a tired bureaucrat named Gunter Schabowski accidentally opened the gate, he proved that the terrifying borders were just lines in the sand, maintained only by our collective fear. The collapse of the Soviet Empire teaches us a profound lesson about the nature of authority. A government can have all the guns, all the prisons, and all the spies. But it cannot survive without legitimacy. Legitimacy is the invisible currency of power. When the people withdraw it, whether by crossing out a name on a ballot or walking through an open gate, the most formidable empires in history can vanish overnight. So, who really ended the Cold War? It wasn't just the superpowers and their summits. It was the ordinary citizen who looked at a ballot, picked up a pen, and checked a box that said, "I choose something else."